If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of our Christians for Liberty network. I am your host, Jacob Winograd. So I'm back here with you guys, and for those of you who are watching on video, you see that the beard is gone, and I know some of you will be saddened by that. I was getting a lot of comments on social media and YouTube and in person, people that really like the beard, but we are entering spring here soon, and the beard is no longer, and the glasses are no longer either, at least tentatively, trying contacts out. So, I don't know, I figured I'd just comment and have a little bit of vanity here at the onset. So, last week's episode was a conversation with Cody Cook on the Anarchist Anabaptist, which I decided to do through the Biblical Anarchy Podcast and not the Green Room, just because I felt like we both focus so much on anarchy that it was good to have that conversation here on this channel rather than make that a green room conversation. And now we're back with another solo episode, and I'm going to pick up where I left off 2 weeks ago, which was my failed attempt to answer 35 objections to biblical anarchy generated by ChatGPT in under 45 minutes. And we had a pretty good start out of the gate with the first 5 questions. And then the second section was objections related to foreign policy and war. And I totally dropped the ball there because that's the subject that I'm the most passionate about, that I have the most to say about. And I was not able to get through those questions, averaging 1 minute to 2 minutes per answer. Surprise, surprise. So anyway, we're going to now pick up we ended on question 12. So that means we have about 23 questions to go through here over various topics that the ChatGPT created for us. So let's go ahead and dive into it. The next section is objections related to economics and property rights. Without a state, how would property rights be enforced? What stops people from stealing land or resources? So there's a lot of objections to a free society, to rejecting the state as a monopoly of law and saying that we can govern ourselves without this centralized institution. And a lot of these objections are sort of based in a very common objection. They'll hone in on specific things like defense, like we talked about a couple episodes ago, or on property rights being enforced, or a very common question is, of course, who will build the roads, so much that it becomes sort of a meme or a joke within libertarian circles. And I would just like to say that there's 2 answers to a lot of these questions. And I'm taking a lot of time on this question, which I shouldn't be doing, but I'm going to just remind everyone, especially for those who maybe aren't libertarians, that for a lot of these questions, I could almost always take what's not really a cop-out answer, but you could take it as one, and just say, this isn't a serious objection, because compared to what? And if you are going to ask, how does my system perfectly provide for something, I'm going to point out how the current system and the state that we have on today and the history of the state does not perfectly solve these problems either. Just like we talked about 2 episodes ago, how invoking a nation state or the creation of a nation state does not guarantee defense or safety from an outside force and invasion. In this case, well, without a state, how would property rights be enforced? Well, oftentimes with states, property rights do not get properly protected or enforced. And we also have to, I think, just acknowledge that even if you're going to say that you need a state to protect property rights, how then are you going to then reconcile that with the fact that the state's very nature is to violate property rights through taxation and through the violation of proportionality, the violation of consent because it's not a voluntary relationship. So there's a lot of things there that would have to be, I think, acknowledged for this question and a lot of questions. I'm not going to repeat this for every question, but I think this is just a question for the libertarian or liberty curious minded to always be asking and thinking about when these questions are being posed. To the heart of the question, in terms of just like, okay, like maybe you accept that the state violates property rights and is perhaps not the best way to govern society, but then there's, I think, good faith questions and curious questions and wonderings about, well, what does it look like to have a law and to protect property rights and have contracts without a state? So even while we have a state today, we do have private contracts, private law, and private arbitration. And so we can look at that and basically extrapolate and say, well, we already have the basis and understanding of how these systems can arise and work. And if we got rid of the state, then those sorts of systems, which are more limited in their scope right now, would very easily and readily be expanded. And I think this would, there's more than one answer to this. And some people postulate, which I agree with, that we would likely have independent liability insurance, essentially, or you could say a dispute resolution organization. And these would be almost like private protection and contract enforcement agencies that we wouldn't be forced to have, but in the same way that if you don't have health insurance or if you don't have, certain coverages or certain certifications, people are less likely to do business with you. That would apply in a free market as well, that people are less likely to want to do business with you. You might not be able to make purchases in certain places without, being able to say, hey, I have, a DRO policy with Allstate or with, ABC company or something like that. So there's private law is a very, novel idea on the surface level, but really, again, we do a lot of this today when it comes to insurance. Car insurance is a good example of this. In the corporate world, there's a lot of private contracts and private litigation. And again, none of this is perfect. It doesn't have to be. I've talked about the nirvana fallacy a lot. But it's possible, right? And I think that's the first hurdle that needs to be passed. That's at the heart of this question is, well, can it be done? And I think that's a resounding yes. We can have it done. Does it rely on a culture that values property rights and free trade and liberty in order to work? Yes. But that's also true of a state, because if you don't have a people who respect the rule of law and who believe in the majority, at least the majority of the people there believe in what those laws are being enforced, the laws become enforceable even by a central power. And we see this with prohibitions, not just throughout history, but even today. I mean, in my lifetime, laws against cannabis were hardly enforceable before you saw a major sweep of decriminalization and legalization measures passed in various states across the country, because so many people were doing it and there just wasn't, in many places, a lot of political will to continue prosecuting people for what amounts to a victimless crime. And gay marriage is another example. And just to piggyback off that doesn't always mean it's good, right? Like when laws are not enforceable, or when laws change and that's due to cultural impact, it doesn't always mean it's 100% good. I think this really, and I'm spending a lot of time on this question here, and it's just a very important question that honestly, again, could be its own podcast entirely. But I think it's important to just recognize that we live in a statist paradigm, and we are not used to thinking of how society could function without the central planner. And the central planner pre-biases us into thinking, well, we have to have a one-size-fits-all solution, and we have to have a plan in place that's going to perfectly solve the problem, even though in reality, the central planner never perfectly solves the problem. So there's a lot of normalcy bias at play when we're talking about this. But I think at the very least, my answer is sufficient for explaining how property rights can be enforced and protected. There was a follow-up to that, like what stops people from stealing land or resources. Again, I mean, contracts, dispute resolution organizations, private defense organizations, individuals who just are protecting their own property with their own means, which even exists today, and culture. And those things have to exist regardless of the system you live on, right? You need a culture, you need people who are going to respect contracts. And then once you have that, then an apples to apples comparison of a culture which respects property and contract in a state versus in a stateless society, you're going to see better outcomes and a more principled understanding. I think actually the state is sort of a barrier to a culture that values contract and private property rights, because the state muddies the playing field because the state doesn't operate by the same rules. So anyway, I think that helps. So the rest of these, I think, should be easy. Who builds the roads? I mean, the state doesn't build the roads today. Construction companies and private firms build the roads, and they're just contracted by the state. And we already have private roads that exist. So this is really more of a question about infrastructure and how it can be complicated, and how do you, plan cities and whatnot. But this can be done and has been done without central planners, right? And businesses are incentivized to have customers come to them to buy their products and to be able to transport their products to other people and have roads to get to their buildings and their homes. And so everyone's incentivized to have roads. So the roads will get paid for. My favorite example is to say that car insurance companies would often sponsor or invest in roads and also do that to sort of enforce private driving regulations as well. So because you're incentivized as an insurance company to mitigate risk, to lower accidents, and so making sure the roads are safe and making sure that the people on the roads are following safety procedures. Those who are licensed, those who you're insuring are going to agree to drive under certain rules and obligations based on their side of the contract. So, all right, 15. Wouldn't a free market without government lead to monopolies and exploitation of the poor? The government is the biggest monopoly, and what we see today is that things like antitrust are very selectively and sparingly over time enforced, and what we have is socialism for the rich. What we have is the destruction of the middle class, the destruction of small businesses, and giant corporations rule the day. And there is some competition, but you have a monopoly. We'll put it this way: it's not a conventional monopoly, but it's a monopoly in effect, in the same way that the two-party system is a monopoly in effect. And we sometimes call this the duopoly. How every election you have two choices, and often these two choices agree on more than they disagree, despite the political theater. And I would say the same is often true of monopolies. And we see this with electrical companies and gas companies. We even see this with internet providers and things like that. And so the state is the biggest monopoly, like I said before. And once the state has power to intervene in the economy, that gets leveraged by businesses and corporations, because instead of having to compete, they can leverage state power to snuff out competition. So in a free market, the general rule is that you only get money from consumers who are voluntarily buying your product, and other people can offer the same product and try to offer it better. And there's no way to actually enforce a monopoly without a state. If a natural monopoly exists, that means it's providing the customers exactly what they want at the price that they want it, and no one thinks that they can do a better job at that or wants to do a better job at that. Doesn't the Bible say that we should care for the poor? How does biblical anarchy provide for those in need without welfare or government assistance? Yes, the Bible says that we, the church, we as people should care for the poor. And the church does this. Even with welfare, the church is still the biggest, and Christians are still the biggest supporters of private charity and missions. And this not only can be done, but we see historically before the invention of the welfare state, there used to also be these mutual aid societies that existed in America and that often helped people with not just sort of like unemployment, but also with healthcare and all sorts of other things, and did so without some of the problems of like the misuse and tragedy of the commons we see with welfare and public resources. So this is actually one of the easier things I think to answer. We should care for the poor. The government and the state, both here in America and abroad and throughout history, is actually the biggest instigator of violence and economic hardship against the poor and the middle class, and pushes the middle class into being poor. So yeah, I think we're going to have a much more prosperous society and better care for the poor without welfare and central planning. What about taxes? Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar." Doesn't this mean taxation is legitimate? So again, I've done full episodes on this, but just to briefly summarize what I would say to that anytime, you have render unto Caesar, you have Romans 13, it's always in the context of paying what is owed, right? And I just think that anytime we're going to say that it should almost be a tautology of sort to say, like, it is morally normative, it is right to pay people what you owe them, right? What is owed to someone, that's an obligation that that ought to be paid. But then it's sort of like, well, that necessarily begs the question of, well, what does it mean that you owe someone something? How do we figure out what is owed and what someone is owed, right? And if your answer to that is Caesar is owed whatever he says he is owed, and says he's owed by extortion, by the threat of force, that doesn't seem to be consistent with a biblical understanding of, property and rights and how we associate with one another on what leaders are supposed to do, because leaders are supposed to be servants. So I would say the only biblically consistent understanding here is, to just default to private property, right? And the same way, like a really clear-cut example is if I use a toll road, I should pay the toll, right? If I use a court, I should pay the court costs, or someone needs to pay the court costs, right? People providing services that are legitimate should be paid. That doesn't mean that the right way or normative way they get paid is through extortion or by saying, we're going to tax you at 30%, 40% of your income and redistribute it for the poor. That's a legitimate, what we're owed, right? So that I think is the quickest answer I can give to that, but I have longer episodes and resources I can put in the description of this episode on that topic. 18, wouldn't biblical anarchy just lead to unregulated capitalism and corruption? I like how they throw the corrupt. I wish they had just asked, wouldn't it lead to unregulated capitalism? Because I would have just said yes and moved on. Or I would say it's more like self-regulated capitalism. And I think I've already kind of touched on how the state doesn't solve the corruption problem. The state's actually, I think, the biggest source of the corruption problem, because once you have power to intervene in the economy, then the rich are going to buy that power, and there's not a really good way to stop that. So 19, what about wages and labor laws? How would workers be protected from abusive employers? Well, for one, there's nothing stopping unions from existing in a free market. There can still be collective bargaining, although it might look a little bit different than what we have under our current system. But yeah, I think insurance would play a role in here, right? And contracts, right? I think right now we sort of rely on the state for a lot of things, but in a free society, people would be predisposed to not relying on sort of the state to solve these problems, and they would go into business agreements saying like, hey, like I need to have like instead of just kind of getting an employee handbook that is just sort of given to you in a lot of places, it'd be like, no, there's going to be an employer contract, which includes things like the employee handbook and rule book, but it also has like, the expectations and responsibilities of the employer. And so there'd be contracts to protect people, and you wouldn't sign up with anyone, to work for them that didn't have a contract that was acceptable. Now, could they make these contracts unwieldy, like the big terms of service things? Possibly. And then you can, some people, there's two ways that could go. It could be no one wants to work for those companies because, let me answer this way, because I don't want to make this answer too long, but I would say in general, we have to always remember the Nirvana fallacy. There could be instances where employers have trick people into bad contracts, and then they get a bad reputation. The employees that work there are, able to share their stories about, and that company gets a bad reputation, and so they either have to change or they're not going to retain employees, right? And competition solves a lot of this. Is it maybe it's not this weird, perfect ideal, but again, I think that's sort of an unnatural or unfair expectations. Hopefully that makes sense. If that's unsatisfactory, that might, this is also going through this list is a opportunity for me to think about, well, maybe there's certain topics that I think I have good answers to, but maybe deserve their own podcast episodes. And on that, while we transition from this section to the next section, let me just remind everyone that if you enjoy what I'm doing here at the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, if you want to support me and support the Libertarian Christian Institute, that we greatly appreciate, first of all, if you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't, or if you're on the audio side, that you leave a 5-star review wherever you're watching. Sharing this on social media with your friends and whatnot and family means a great deal as well. I think part of my reason for making my Biblical Anarchy Redux and kind of going on this sort of journey of sort of revisiting the core principles is to hopefully give you guys who are listening and who like the show opportunities to share these things with people, to say, that even like people in your church, to, plant some seeds and to get people thinking about this. And these are good introductory episodes, I think, into sort of the topics that we like to talk about. And also, if you want to support the show even more, as always, you can go to biblicalanarchypodcast.com, click the donate link, and you can sign up for either a one-time donation or a $10 a month or more donation to become an LCI insider, which nets you all sorts of perks, including free ebooks and early access, discounts, behind the scenes. We have I don't think we've announced it yet. We have something in the works that'll be pretty cool for the insiders, a way for you guys to connect with us here at LCI more. So sign up and you'll be able to be the first ones who are part of that. All right. The next section is objections related to law and justice. Without a government, who enforces justice? How would murderers and thieves be punished? So I think I've kind of touched on this with the property rights stuff already. You have private law. Murderers can be dealt with either in the moment in self-defense or, I guess the murder part. So like stealing or breaking of contract is kind of what I covered. How do you deal with murderers is perhaps a little bit more difficult. So the most preferred normative way is that people have these, insurance agencies or contracts, individual liability that they sign up with. And just like, to look at it this way, a private law society is built upon a very complicated web of contracts, right? A very intricate web. And the contracts and the private law, right? That's why it's called private law. These private contracts and agreements are the basis of the emergent law in society and the emergent laws, right? There's the objective law in terms of what philosophers and political theorists discover through reason in terms of the underlying principles, which then are used to inform courts and whatnot in terms of how to rightly rule on things. But then you have your contracts and agreements and whatnot. And most of these would include sort of like, maybe it would seem sort of silly, but they would include things like not harming others and not murdering others and, sort of like punishment clauses if that happened. And what happens after that? Well, murderers can be dealt with through complete ostracism, like, economic sort of sanction where no one does business with that person anymore. And, there could be private courts and private prisons that would, even with a certain burden of proof being met and, private suits being filed to be like, we have evidence that this person committed murder and breached this contract and is probably a threat to people. And so there could be ways of even detaining certain people. This is a very important topic, which deserves more than I can give in like a 2-minute answer. I will say that there are different thoughts to justice within the libertarian world, because while there is restitution and retribution, there's also a concept known as restorative justice, which I have done an episode on a while back, and that was with Carrie Baldwin, fellow LCI associate. And I can't remember if we did that on the Biblical Anarchy podcast or if that was back on the Daniel 3 podcast. I'll have to go and try to find that, but it's probably either way. It's probably at the time where that conversation deserves a revisit and an update. So again, this is good for get me thinking about more content ideas. And I think revisiting restorative justice and just, the upholding of justice beyond just, I think people can really latch on to easily like, contracts and property rights, but murder and rape and sexual assault and, the really evil things in society. I think people want to hear, how does that get solved in a free market? And good answers to that are sort of like taking the foundation I've built here, but would need to be further explained. And I can't do that succinctly, but I can put some notes in the show notes, and I think an upcoming episode should be planned. Doesn't anarchy lead to mob justice or vigilante violence? Without a state, what stops lawlessness? What's funny is I've been watching the new Daredevil show, and that show really highlights how, now granted this is a fictional universe, but I think it has real life corollaries that that state system of justice, our criminal justice system is so broken in both the MCU and in real life that it leads to the sort of higher demand for vigilantism and for mob justice, right? And for riots and things like that. So the state, listen, nothing's perfect, right? And I like that Thomas Sowell quote that there's no solutions, only trade-offs. But the criminal justice system, insofar as it's a centrally planned system, I think it is a totally failed experiment and is not we don't want a society of lawlessness or chaos. That's not what biblical anarchy is about. That's not what libertarianism is about. But I think it's rather it's many things, but two things in this context. It's the recognition that the state is not a good provider of these things, doesn't solve those problems very well. And that on the contrary, it often is the greatest purveyor of lawlessness and chaos and creates more distortions in that realm. So yeah, I mean we have the world's biggest prison population and we still have rampant crime. So something's broken and we need better solutions than the state can provide. The Bible commands civil punishment for crimes. How would that work under biblical anarchy? I think I've kind of given a lot of answers to that effect already. In general, you have economic sanctions on individuals, ostracism from society, and you can't have private courts and defense organizations to deal with very violent criminals. But again, appealing back to the first answer I gave, nothing's perfect, right? And we have to recognize that there's many instances of murders and crimes falling through the cracks in our current system. So you might be able to postulate in the answers I gave, well, there's a possibility, like, what if this, and this happened and the person gets away with evil? It's like, well, that happens. That happens in today's society, right? The beauty of the free market is innovation and competition, which are incentives that have a bend towards improving over time. State solutions, which are based on monopoly and coercion, don't have the same incentives towards improvement over time. And then you have things like the public choice theory, which basically show that our leaders are not actually governing with our interests in mind, but more with theirs, and both preserving their power. And so, nothing's perfect, but if we're looking at the trade-offs and we're looking at the incentive structures, I think we come away with some very, very damning observations and conclusions about the state. Wouldn't private arbitration favor the rich over the poor? How would the weak get justice without a central authority? Well, state arbitration favors the rich over the poor. So again, it's just always comparing to the status quo. Compared to what? If you're rich enough, you can get away with any crime. And if you're poor enough, you can almost be wrongly convicted of any crime because you don't have the means of properly hiring good representation to defend yourself. And there's bias in court systems. So is it possible private arbitration could have some of the same problems? Perhaps, but wouldn't there also be private charity organizations aimed at helping those who are impoverished? And there's also the hope that the free market is a tide that raises all ships. And so hopefully we don't have as many people who are poor, which would also have a correlate of hopefully reducing crime as well. If someone violates a contract or commits fraud, who holds them accountable? Anyone that they had a contract with, and the dispute resolution organizations that have been contracted to rule on that broken contract, or when fraud is committed. Doesn't the Old Testament law show that God established a legal system? Why shouldn't we follow that today? Because the Old Testament law was for Old Testament Israel. It was a special covenant for a special time in a very specific place that had a ultimate purpose of pointing to Christ and showing our need for a savior. And I think there's a lot of assumptions in there. This question is something a theonomist would ask, right? So I think understanding covenant theology, which I need to touch on some more in some upcoming episodes, and understanding the purpose of the of the Mosaic civil law was not, like, they're sort of like baked into this question, the assumption that, well, if God gave this law, wouldn't it be a perfect law? But I think that's an assumption, and that's begging the question. I think it was a good law for those people at that time. But I believe in progressive revelation. I believe in not just the progressive unfolding of God's redemptive plan, but the progressive efforts of God to morally advance God's people and society, broadly speaking. And there were just clearly provisions in the Mosaic covenant law that were simultaneously progressive for the context that the Israelites were coming from in moving away from more barbaric ways of governing society, but that we've also clearly grown past, and that even Jesus sort of, there's a tension there where Jesus sort of pushes us to grow past certain mindsets and sentiments and understandings. So that's it's a good question, bit complicated, but I think there's a reason why we shouldn't hate the Old Testament law or look down upon it or, become Marcionites and say it was evil and that the God of the Old Testament was evil and barbaric. But we have to understand these things in context, and their covenantal and historical context. All right, 2 more sections here. How am I doing on time? I have 10 minutes left if I want to keep this in the 45-minute frame. So here's what we're going to do. I haven't been timing myself here, but I'm doing better than last time. So I'm going to look up a stopwatch. I'm going to try to rapid fire these. Okay. This next section is objections related to society and culture. What about morality? if there's no government, what stops people from legalizing things like abortion or drugs? And go. We already have abortion and drugs. I don't know what that even questions. Like, again, it's always compared to what? You can create a better system that disincentivizes and bans abortion and hard drugs from falling into the wrong hands of children, especially without the state. The war on drugs is a total failure. We're the world's biggest prison population because of the war on drugs primarily, and it has not curbed the demand for drugs. It's empowered the cartels. We have to stop always thinking in terms of like, well, this is bad, so therefore we need the state to ban it. We need to understand what the role of the civil magistrate is. It's there to deal with aggression. Drug use, while often bad, is not aggression. We need the right mechanisms from a normative perspective for solving these societal problems that don't violate proportionality, that don't initiate aggression, and that are going to actually work. And just virtue signaling and saying like it's bad, so pass a law because it's bad for society, that doesn't work. And I know some people say, like, I remember Wolf asking me once, well, can't the law serve a sort of pedagogical, I think it's the right word, role, like a teaching role? And I just think parents and the church should have the teaching role in society. We got to be very careful, and we should as Christians recognize the extreme danger in creating a society where the state has a authoritative teaching and leading role in society, because that is ripe to get misused. All right. Next question. Wouldn't biblical anarchy lead to moral relativism? Without a central authority, who determines right from wrong? And with a central power, here's my answer, you also get moral relativism, or you get worse. You get moral inversion. You get the state, because it's incentivized to, calling what is good evil and what is evil good. And you always have to worry about moral relativism in society, but the solution to that is the gospel. The solution to that is the church being the prophetic and moral witness to society. And what shapes culture and society to make it more good is the Holy Spirit and the example of the church, the example of those who have been transformed by the gospel, living lives that serve as a beacon of light, and who are doing acts of service in their community, which draw more people into the direct influence of the church, even if they have not yet been saved. The state is not meant to do this. It fails at doing this, and it often does the exact opposite and just does evil. So, all right. If the state is illegitimate, should Christians just withdraw from politics altogether? They could. I'm not going to say that the Bible says definitively one way or the other, because Christians disagree on this. You know, last episode, I think, was a good conversation between me and Cody and exploring some of these tensions between isolationist sort of mindset here. And while Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, I do believe it is for this world. So it depends on how you define politics. If by politics you mean running for office and voting, I think you do need to. I've actually touched on this, and I'll put it in the show notes. I answered this exact question a while back on the Faith Seeking Freedom podcast, also produced by LCI. But just to summarize my answer, Christians can serve in capital P politics faithfully, but with careful consideration because of the concerns about allegiances and concerns about having to uphold bad laws. And beyond that, lowercase p politics is really all of society. And I think Christians need to be very active in engaging in lowercase p politics, because politics is downstream from culture, right? And so we should be, I'm a Kuyperian, right? We should be transforming culture. We should be trying to push the Overton window. So that's my answer. All right. Wouldn't biblical anarchy lead to a breakdown of families and communities? It's a weird question. I don't know why it would. That wouldn't lead to a breakdown of families and communities. No, I think the state leads to a breakdown of families and communities, because the state becomes the community. The state has been waging a war against the family unit, the nuclear family, for decades. through various institutions like the education, the Department of Education, and the welfare, and all sorts of things. So the state has no incentive for there to be a strong church and for there to be strong families, because if church and family are strong, people don't need the state, and the state wants people to need it. Doesn't the church need the state protection to flourish? How can Christianity survive in an anarchist society? I almost think that question's ridiculous on its face, but Christianity has often had the exact opposite concern. It had the concern of, how do we survive under this state that's persecuting us? Kind of a silly question. I'm not saying government can't protect religious liberties, and I guess that's kind of the heart of the question, and even to the extent America was founded by those trying to create religious liberty, they were doing that by fleeing states that were persecuting religious liberty. So at best, it's like you use the state to protect religious liberty because otherwise it persecutes it. Well, I mean, who's going to persecute your religious liberty in a free society? We need that question answered to really answer this question and take it more seriously. The last section was on Christian nationalism. I've done so much content on Christian nationalism that I don't think I'm going to go through these for sake of time. I'll just kind of say that my objections to Christian nationalism and answers to that are on display. I've done recent episodes on that. And that in general, the gospel is for people and for nations and for the world. And so lowercase Christian nationalism, sure, yeah, I'd love to live in a Christian nation, but beware the Mott and Bailey, because it's often like, oh, cool, you want to live in a Christian nation too, and that's why we need, Sabbath laws and blasphemy laws, and to have a civil establishment of religion. And I think really what this comes down to is, especially for those of us who come from the Reformed world, like I do, and a lot of Christian nationalists are Reformed, I think that we have a flawed understanding of the role of the church and the role of the civil magistrate, and things like sphere sovereignty come into play here. And yeah, I think when you understand the gospel, you understand covenant theology, you understand the role of the church, and you understand the role of the civil magistrate, you come to the correct conclusions. But when you get any of those four things wrong, you end up in some bad places. So that's all I have for you guys for today's episode. I hope you liked it. Again, please, all the things, the likes, the subscribing, the notification bell, the 5-star reviews. If you enjoy this podcast, it means a lot to us here, and it means a lot to me. And I will be back with you guys next week. Until then, live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.